So it could be made in some different ways. What we're going to use is something that's made from something called natural hydraulic lime. It's actually a pre-made product that is, all you have to do is add water to it. But there's many different ways. We don't have time for a full mortar discussion, but I'll just try to give you the kind of guidelines to what you don't want to do and what you want to look toward. And so we don't want to use a modern super hard mortar because it's not going to be compatible. And so these historic materials, in fact, this is marble and that's marble. So the marble is just much more soft, is much softer than a lot of other, modern materials, and especially over time it tends to weather and actually become more porous and softer. We're looking for compatibility. So the risk is that if we use a mortar that's super hard, like a typical modern mortar, that it's more likely if it gets hit or knocked, it'll just break right off where it meets the keyway. And so the principle is to allow a little movement and flexibility. This is coming from the field of architecture, and this is extremely relevant and even more probably critical in many respects in a structure. And so if we're talking about a historic brick structure that was made generally before 1900, the bricks are much softer, and so the idea is that the mortar should be similar in hardness to the masonry we're using it with. And so this particular mortar, anyway, if you wanted to buy this, we sell it and we put it in buckets like this also, and we call it historic pointing mortar, just like I'm calling it. It's actually, it's a long story, but it's actually coming from Germany because it's made from natural hydraulic lime, which is like an alternative to Portland cement. So it's kind of like a nuanced discussion to get into. You can make historic pointing mortar from other materials, like you could actually make it from Portland cement, but you'd have to blend it yourself. And so you'd have to get Portland cement, hydrated lime, and sand, and then mix it in the proper proportions, and you would have a mortar sort of like this. But anyway, it's sort of a big discussion, so I'm just going to kind of give you a very abbreviated version of it. I could answer questions if someone has a question. That might be easier. So anyone want to contribute anything or ask anything about it?
Well, I've used latex in place of water for a thin set mortar mix. Have you ever needed latex to get a more rubbery, crack resistant, thin spread?
It's a good question. Short answer is I don't want to add latex to this for sure, and no, I don't like to do that. I know of one company that does that. It depends what you're doing. Okay, so there's a lot, but generally speaking, we're dealing with historic materials. We don't want latex in it. Okay, this is like a traditional mortar that I'm making here. Again, we could make this in different ways, but we don't want latex. We don't need latex in it. I mean, I get your point, but it's a good question. But there is no latex in this. So I'll just mention, a traditional lime mortar is made by taking anything calcium carbonate, including just shells. Actually, you can just take shells and you cook them in a hot fire or a kiln. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that just you could cook them in a hot fire and end up with the same result as a kiln, but that they will be converted to something called quicklime after a certain amount of time, and if the fire's hot enough. And quicklime is a highly reactive material. It's kind of a building block ingredient that also made plaster, lime plaster, as well as lime mortars. Anyway, if you take shells or limestone or marble or chalk in some areas, they're all calcium carbonate. And if you cook that in a kiln, and it's about 1700 Fahrenheit for about 24 hours, but much less for smaller shells and things, it will convert it into quicklime, as I said. And then when you add water to that, that's called slaking lime, and it'll break that down. And so the shells or the limestone will get lighter actually from cooking off the carbon dioxide. Then when you add moisture back to it, if it's very pure calcium carbonate, like a high white or pure shells, it will be a very reactive process, and it will actually get hot and spit and release heat. It's an exothermic reaction, and so that's called slaking lime. Then if you add sand to that, that's a lime mortar. That's all that's in a pure lime mortar. Now the thing about a lime mortar is it takes forever to harden. It only hardens by carbonation, which is drawing the carbon dioxide back from the air into the stone, into the mortar, excuse me. And so it takes forever. And so then Portland cement is like the opposite. Portland cement's a manufactured material that's made from like clay and limestone and other pozzolans, things that make it get hard fast. And it's super heated and ground super fine, and it's highly, highly reactive. And so it chemically hardens, and the ingredients combine, and it gets hard quickly. Okay, and that's what everyone's used to. All construction is done with Portland cement today. Okay, now the material we're using is called natural hydraulic lime. It's kind of like somewhere in the middle. Okay, just in a nutshell. And so it has a lot of positive working characteristics. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and lay this into the keyway. And it's a shallow keyway, but it's just deep enough for the way they designed this. And we're going to run some up the edge. Okay, now generally whenever we're doing historic masonry work with mortars, we always want a damp surface. And the reason for that is that if we go onto a dry surface, we're going to get, the moisture is going to get drawn out of the mortar into the stone, and it's going to cure too quickly. And you can get what's called a flash cure, and that means it'll never harden properly, and it'll solidify, but it won't ever actually cure. So, pretty wet right now, so I'll just dry it out a little bit. Now the stone is still damp. It's starting to dry, but it's still pretty damp. I'll just leave this here for a second and dry out some of this heavy. It's a little excess moisture on it. And then we'll go ahead and put this tablet, the broken tablet, into here, and then we can work on finishing it up. Any other questions about anything we're doing?
Something I've noticed you haven't mentioned, just for those that don't know about why you should not use concrete or saccharine, put headstones in them.
I didn't understand you. I'm sorry. I can't hear you.
Just mentioning that people should not put headstones in concrete or saccharine.
We never want to embed anything into wet cement concrete, like modern concrete, period. Even whether it's modern monument, we never want to embed anything into it, or it's going to create a situation where it's impossible to ever rework. And so modern monuments generally should have a concrete foundation, or they do in most areas, but it shouldn't be glued to it. And so the concrete should be done ahead of time, and then the installation should not be at the same time, okay? So we can go ahead and put this in, if you would, since you're standing there. And okay, so we can do a little back and forth movement now. There's a little liquefaction. It's a pretty tight joint, actually, which is a kind of a good thing, actually. So it actually rose up. That's what we want. It's pretty much going to stay, probably, right? Look up. It's not going to go far. So that's pretty good. It actually filled a lot of the joint right up, which is really awesome. And so there's a big variability in how tight a keyway is and how much slack there is, and this one is very tight. And so actually that kind of connects the dots. The reason they could get away with such a shallow mortise is because they made a very tight margin, and so there's much less kind of leeway back and forth, and so that was part of the design. So they intentionally did that, and so because if it was wider, it would just be all over the place. And so with this design, there's very little mortar going in, and so I didn't make that much, but I made a little more probably even than I need. Not too far off, but it's a little wet, so I'm going to raise it up, go up a little higher, and then dry it out a little, and then work on putting a little kind of a wash on it, and I'll show you what I mean, and then this will join together quite quickly.